Al Jazeera has released a new documentary about what really happened on October the 7th, and its most striking findings concern the possibility that multiple Israelis were killed on that day by their own side. This is an Al Jazeera news report based on the footage from the documentary.
In the chaotic early hours of October 7, Israeli forces scrambled to engage Hamas fighters. Apache helicopter gunships fired onto cars driving towards Gaza, aware that some of them were carrying captives.
אני באוויר, באחת הגיחות נאמר כבר שיש חטופים.
ואז מה עושים? איך מבצעים ירי על מי שחוזר לכיוון הגבול?
זו שאלה טובה, וזו דילמה סופר מורכבת.
כל ההחלטה עכשיו היא עליך.
נכון.
אין עם מי לדבר.
כן, אין עם מי לדבר.
Without guidance, some pilots said they joined local WhatsApp groups to help pick targets.
The idea that pilots have to get information from WhatsApp groups is truly remarkable. It's a sign of the initiative that people are looking for any way that they can get the information. This is an outrage. I mean, what kind of a way is that to fight a modern war?
At least 70 vehicles were hit by attack helicopters.
To me, it's inexcusable for a helicopter or any weapon system to be engaging any target if you don't know what that target is. Now, my concern is, with this footage, we cannot tell whether they're Hamas gunmen or civilians or possibly hostages. And I don't believe the helicopter pilot or the machine gun operator would be able to tell either.
These big rounds have a certain area of effect and obviously come at a certain rate that if you shoot at a group of people, you're most likely going to kill everyone. You are knowingly putting your own civilians at risk.
The I unit compiled a detailed list of those killed on October 7. It found that 27 captives died somewhere between their homes and the Gaza fence. The circumstances of those deaths have not been explained. 12 more civilian deaths took place in Be'eri kibbutz after an attack by police and army forces on a house there containing captives. Israel's Channel 12 spoke to survivors.
והם הביאו פתאום טנק, אני אומרת לאחד החיילים, תגיד, אבל אם אתם יורים פגזים זה לא יפגע בבני ערובה? אז הוא אומר לי, לא, אנחנו רק עושים את זה בצדדים, להוריד קירות. הם נהרגו מרסיסים, הם לא נהרגו כי רצחו אותם, הם נהרגו מהירי. היה שם ירי מטורף על הבית, מטורף. טנק הגיע וירה בפגזים. אז זה היה. אם זה קרה, זה היה, אם הם מתו כל הבני ערובה, זה רק מהירי.
The investigative unit asked the Israeli army for comment on its actions on October 7. They did not reply.
I spoke earlier to the director of that Al Jazeera documentary. He's called Richard Sanders. And I began by asking him how many civilians he thought could have been killed by Israeli forces on October the 7th.
It's quite difficult really pinning down the specifics of how many people die and in what way they die. We've put an enormous amount of work into this and have this a list we've drawn up. We can't pretend it's definitive. One of the oddities of the whole story is that the Israelis farm out the collection of bodies to this organization called Zaka, which is a voluntary ultra-Orthodox religious organization, which firstly is, they're amateurs. They're not professionals. They're not trained in this sort of thing. They're particularly not trained in forensics. And also, to be fair to them, they were simply overwhelmed. The scale of this was something they'd never done before. But it's quite clear that bodies were not photographed in situ. Careful notes of exactly where bodies were found and in what state they were found were not made. So an absolutely clear and definitive map of who died, where they died, how they died, why they died, will probably never be done simply because of the mistakes that were made in the first sort of 48 hours after the massacre itself. Now, it's quite clear that a number of people were killed by Israeli forces. The Israeli newspaper Yediot Aronot has reported that the Hannibal Directive was issued at midday on the 7th. Now, the Hannibal Directive is something the Israelis have used in the past. It results from the embarrassments they've had where they've had to exchange hundreds, even thousands of Palestinian prisoners for just one Israeli soldier. They clearly wanted to avoid that happening again. And a directive, it's widely accepted, was issued to the Israeli military that if soldiers look like they're going to be captured and taken off to Lebanon or to the Gaza Strip or wherever, better to kill everyone than to allow that to happen. Now, that directive was supposedly rescinded a few years ago, but it's been reported in the Israeli press, or specifically by Yediot Aharonot, that it was revived at midday on the 7th, and the Israeli army has not denied this. Now, we have two types of friendly fire that happen. The first is Apache gunships, which are mobilized from very early on the 7th. For a long time, in fact, they're the only sort of presence the Israeli Defense Force has in the area at all. Now, we have definitive proof that one hostage is killed by an Apache gunship. But if you actually just look at the footage, and the Israelis released enormous amounts of footage, gun camera footage, I think in an effort to show they were doing something on the 7th. If you just look at that footage, common sense tells you in a lot of those shots, at least, they can't possibly know who they're shooting at. Now, we scrutinized the data very, very carefully, and we came up with a figure of 27 people who are clearly taken hostage and clearly and leave their homes, are taken from their homes, are taken into the sort of possession of Palestinian gunmen, but never make it to the fence and die in circumstances that have not been explained. It seems to me there is a fairly strong probability that a number of them were killed by fire from helicopter gunships. Zaka told us they had handed over 21 bodies to the authorities, which they identified as Palestinian bodies, which were then sent back. They said, no, these are Israeli bodies. And again, common sense would suggest those were bodies that were not found in their homes and were found surrounded by Palestinians. Again, that may be an indication of people who were killed by helicopter gunships. You then have people who are killed by friendly fire from ground forces. There's one particular incident in Kibbutz Be'eri where 12 people are killed, and they're almost certainly killed by the Israeli police and army. And we know about this because we have survivors. It's quite likely there are a number of other incidences where people are killed by Israeli forces that we don't know about because there are no survivors. And you just have to. It was a very interesting thing as the press went into the kibbutzim in the days after October the 7th. You can often hear them sort of looking around them saying, hang on, the scale of damage here can't have been done by people with RPGs, rocket-propelled grenades, and machine guns. Something bigger has been used here. Now, some of that damage is fire damage. Hamas were setting fire to houses to try and drive people out of their safe rooms. So, sometimes houses are destroyed by fire, and that is very likely to be Hamas. But a lot of houses are ruined, that they'd just collapsed and had not been burned down. They'd clearly been hit by Israeli fire. So we came up with a figure of 18 people we're quite certain were killed by Israeli ground forces. But again, there's a potential larger number of people who were found under the rubble of their destroyed home, and we simply don't know how they died.
Having watched the documentary, it seems there's two big arguments you're making about both Israel and the Western media, which is that many of the sort of sadistic atrocities that we heard about were exaggerated or simply didn't happen. And also, Israeli forces did kill some Israelis, so-called friendly fire. Let's be clear, though, because you did also show that Hamas committed lots of war crimes and killed lots of people, right? So can you talk about that, please?
This film is not an apologia for Hamas and the other people who passed through the fence that day. We've identified people who were killed by the Israelis. They are a small minority. Even the highest possible number of people who were killed by the Israelis remain a small minority of the overall number of unarmed civilians who were killed that day. You watch the first half of the film, and we lay it out in graphic detail, just exactly what Hamas do that day. And they kill almost 800 unarmed civilians. That is absolutely clear. And we shouldn't shy away from that. We then spend the second half of the film talking about what Hamas did not do. And this is specifically the sort of butchering and murdering and mutilating of babies and widespread and systematic rape. Now, this is not pedantry. This is not nitpicking. We're not saying all people died in this way rather than in that way. It's significant because in justifying the scale and the ferocity of the Israeli response, of the assault on the Gaza Strip and the bombardment and the number of civilian casualties, again and again, Israeli and Western politicians reference babies and rape. It's what's used again and again to justify the savagery of the Israeli response. Now, let's break them down. Babies, in a way, is pretty straightforward, I'm afraid. You look at the list of the dead. There are two babies there. One baby is killed when a bullet is fired through the door of a safe room in Kibbutz Be'eri. The other baby, the mother is hit in her car, and there's an emergency cesarean, and the baby dies. So those are the two babies that die on October the 7th. Neither is beheaded, neither is burned. So every story you see about babies that does not correspond to those two, and there are a lot of stories about babies, is untrue. Okay, and that immediately flags up for you that there is a huge problem with information that is coming from first responders, from Israeli army officials, and from Israeli government officials. There is a huge problem, and if there is a huge problem of that with babies, then there's likely to be a big problem in other areas. Now let's turn to the very vexed and fraught issue of rape. The Israelis maintain they've been rather abandoned by feminists around the world who don't seem to regard the suffering of Israeli women as seriously as they would others. Now, again, we've looked into this very, very carefully. Firstly, we're not saying there were no rapes on October the 7th. There quite possibly will have been. Invariably, when young men have guns and are licensed to commit violence, there is sexual violence, invariably. So we're not saying there was no rape at all. We simply don't know. What there clearly was not was a widespread, systematic, weaponized, instrumentalized rape. And we say that because there simply isn't the evidence for it. You look at the visual evidence. We've looked at 7 hours of footage from October the 7th, dash cams and body cams from dead Hamas fighters, CCTV and that sort of thing. And there's no indication of sexual violence on that material, none at all. You then have thousands of post-mortem photos. None of, they'll point to an image of a woman with blood on her trousers. Really, if that is the strongest evidence they have, it's really not very strong. And the Israelis keep referencing images. They talk a lot about young women tied to trees, tied to posts, with their lower half of their clothing removed. But there's no images of this. There's no images at all. Now, Zaka says, well, look, we weren't asked to take images. We weren't systematically doing this. It's not what we're trained for, and so on. Even so, it's surprising not to have a single image that really supports the idea that there was widespread rape or rape at all, in fact, is odd and raises questions. There was, of course, one image which we took rather seriously and looked into quite closely, a young woman who is killed 9 miles north of the music festival site. There is a very graphic video of her that was put up online by the Israelis. They did blur it, but you can see she's not wearing any underwear. And she's lying by a main roadside. This was held up, and this became the centerpiece of a report in the New York Times, where the New York Times was alleging widespread and systematic rape. And it fell apart within days because the family came out and said, hold on, we know she wasn't raped. They'd received a text from her just a few minutes before she died. Also, very importantly, her husband, who I believe subsequently died, from the moment she died and for 44 minutes afterwards, was on the phone to his brother and never mentioned a rape in the course of this whole conversation. So that evidence is simply missing. It's very striking that it's missing. There's no forensic evidence. Again, they can point to the chaos of the day and so on, but there is, the fact is there is no forensic evidence. The other thing, again, I'd invite you just to apply journalistic common sense here. There are a couple of witnesses. Okay, there's one or two others who've been interviewed by individual journalists, but then seem to have disappeared. But there's a couple of witnesses who we include in the film. Now, these rapes are supposedly happening at the music festival site, which is an open site. It's an outdoor festival. And although hundreds of people are killed at that music festival, the overwhelming majority of people are not killed. The majority of people there survive. There are thousands of people there, and the majority survive. Again, there can be explanations for this. People are traumatized. They may not come forward for some time, and all this is true. Even so, common sense says you would expect more witnesses. If people are being raped out in the open on a widespread scale, certainly you would expect more witnesses. The two witnesses that have come forward one of them, a police witness who is anonymous, also says she saw gunmen carrying the severed heads of 3 women around, which no one else saw. And the one who is not anonymous, again, I mean, it's striking. He's hiding behind a bush. There are 5 other people behind the bush with him, and none of them have said they saw a rape. So I'm not disputing what he says. That he's given his testimony. He's given it a number of times. But even with the witnesses there are 1 or 2 questions spring to mind. So I've given you a very long answer there, but it's obviously a very important and fraught and sensitive subject. And having looked at the evidence very carefully, we simply feel there is not the evidence for widespread and systematic rape. And Human Rights Watch, very, very reputable, a very serious human rights organization, is doing a very in-depth study. And I would urge people, before they reach final conclusions, to wait and read the Human Rights Watch report in a couple of months.
You've talked there about sort of the approach that one should take to testimony. And I know that immediately after October the 7th, I was quite surprised at sort of how basically all the TV channels and journalists were speaking to people from this organization, Zaka, and especially one of their leaders called Yossi Landau, as if what they were saying was gospel. And this wasn't just sort of right-wing media outlets. Channel 4 News, I distinctly remember, sort of had a somewhat falling interview with him, in fact. And you demonstrate, I think, very well in your documentary that many of the things that this man, Yossi Landau, told the media couldn't possibly be true. Where do you think the media has gone wrong in sort of listening and amplifying people's testimony? Because obviously, the media shouldn't ignore testimony from first responders, but clearly something has gone wrong here.
Firstly, to be fair to the media, you assume you're being told the truth by first responders. Why wouldn't you be being told the truth? Then, to be fair to the first responders, I think they were quite traumatized. They had seen dreadful things. They were overwhelmed. As Zaka itself eventually said, they are not forensically trained and were often providing interpretations of things they've seen, but they had no qualifications to present. I think what was unforgivable is, as the days went by, that the media didn't start to scrutinize more. And with the babies, the 14 babies, many of whom were beheaded, I mean, that actually began to unravel fairly quickly, And once that had unraveled, at that point, skepticism should have kicked in. And once skepticism had kicked in, it should also have been applied to the sexual violence issue. And that's where I think the media, the Western media, really failed. Western media and Western politicians. I mean, the Israeli government was quite happy to parrot all this stuff. And you see in our film, you see Biden picking it up. You see David Lammy picking it up. They ought to have questioned it. And the media, the Western media ought to have been questioning it. And on the sexual violence thing, The Guardian, the BBC, the New York Times all did very similar pieces where when you read it really carefully, they were clearly taking almost all their information from Israeli officials and first responders. And it's rather surprising they weren't exercising more skepticism and scrutiny at that point.
So you've talked about the extent to which sort of the Western media took for granted that Hamas had done things which it doesn't seem there is sufficient evidence to say they in fact did. And you sort of said that that's incredibly relevant because it is. It's by posing this image of absolute disgust. These were sort of sadistic, depraved people that the justification for a genocidal war has sort of been made. But you are clear that Hamas did commit war crimes. And I suppose after investigating this incident and making this documentary, do you feel that you are any wiser as to what Hamas were trying to do on that day? What do we know they did? And do you have a sense of why they did it, what they were thinking?
I think it's very straightforward why they did it. And I think Dr. Bassem Naim in our film explains it. One of the, again, very peculiar things about Western coverage is in all the Western coverage I've seen, people never reference the Great March of Return. In 2018, 2019, Palestinians in the Gaza Strip peacefully demonstrated for months on end, demanding a return to their lands, freedom, justice, and so on. And the Israelis simply lined up behind certain berms and shot them. The hundreds were killed. there was a very clear, peaceful mass protest movement, and it was brutally crushed. Over 60 people were killed in a single day on one day. And, frankly, bluntly, here in Britain, we spent the whole of that period talking about anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, and it was remarkable. It was extraordinary. They made these enormous sacrifices. The Palestinians basically worked out that they had to die in very large numbers to make headlines in the West. And they did die in very large numbers, and they didn't really make the headlines in the West. It made no difference at all. Now, Dr. Naim in our film says, and I think there's no reason not to take this absolutely at face value, many times they discussed in the sort of National Council of Hamas, what are we going to do? What do we do? I mean, we either sit here and die, or we have to do something. And they decided to do something, and this is what they did. Now, why they killed so many civilians? Because they could have done this, and they could have bypassed the kibbutzim. They could have purely attacked military targets, because there are plenty of military targets around the Gaza Strip. I think the game plan was to take hostages, as much as possible. I think, and again, I hope this is clear in the film, they were taken by surprise by the success. They hadn't expected the Israeli military to just fold in front of them. I mean, extraordinary. You remember the reputation the Israeli military has. And, I think this is why some sort of wild conspiracy theories started to do the rounds in the days after October the 7th. It was astonishing, the Israeli intelligence and military failure. And it meant that Hamas suddenly found themselves, masters of the terrain. They had freedom of movement. At that point, and again, we make this point in the film, I think their deficiencies as a military organization were revealed. Basically, the way it works in war is young men with guns will behave badly if you let them. Okay, young men with guns, a significant proportion of young men with guns, given license to do what they want, will behave very badly. That's pretty much a given in war. What stops them doing that is good leadership, particularly good sort of platoon level, ground level leadership. And it was quite clear Hamas didn't have that. So once they were there, they had free reign in the kibbutzes and so on. The leadership to rein in these young men was lacking. I mean, in fact, in the footage I've seen, the sort of company commanders and platoon commanders, whatever they are engaging in it as well. So I can certainly see what Hamas were trying to do strategically, politically, and so on. And there's an obvious logic to that. The wholesale killing of civilians, first and foremost, obviously is morally wrong. It's wrong whoever does it. But secondly, it seems to me it was strategically, tactically wrong as well, because it did give the Israelis initially, at least, an enormous amount of moral capital, which they were quite prepared to make use of. You look back throughout history, when you have slave uprisings, when you have uprisings of indigenous peoples, subject peoples, in the Indian Mutiny, as we still call it, as a classic example, in repressing that, people will always accuse the rebels of murdering babies and raping women. It's a tried and tested tactic throughout the ages to dehumanize people and to portray them as savages, as Marco Rubio actually calls the Palestinians in our film. And given that that is such an established historical pattern, again, it's quite remarkable in the days and weeks after October the 7th that more people in the Western media didn't hear some alarm bells ringing about the rhetoric that was being used about what had supposedly happened on October the 7th.
That was Richard Sanders, whose Al Jazeera documentary will be out later this week. We'll be doing more coverage of that documentary when it is out, because there's lots of really, really significant content in that I think you'll like to see.